one I wanted to do separately. This is from Miss Hazel. She needs help with clothing tomorrow morning at 10:30. She's asking for 1 hour. We're getting a lot more stuff in, as we always do. She's got a lot more stuff in, so she's asking for 1 hour tomorrow to help her with that. Guys, if you could come, if nothing else, just be out there with her. Having a lady here by herself may not be the most comfortable thing and most the way it is, world we live in. But everything should be fine. But she would certainly love an hour of assistance. Okay, if you can come and help, that would be even greater. So just be mindful of that. I'll make this announcement again before we leave this morning, if she'll remind me. You got to remind me, right? All right. Not last week, week before, what have we been discussing, folks? Joshua. What about Joshua? Where's Joshua at this point in our study? They're camped outside where? Jericho. All right, in chapter 5, what's happened in chapter 5? It's kind of given an unusual account. What's happened right before chapter 6 in verse 13? Chapter 5 and verse 13. We have a man who comes to them, right? If you look, it says in verse 13, and I'm just going to read over this quickly because we're going to get into chapter 6. It came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho, in other words, the congregation was encamped outside of Jericho. They're a little ways away, that a man comes. He said, he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. Now, I don't know how your translation, the translation that you're using, if you'll notice that the capital letters for his and man are capitalized. Now, they typically don't do that unless what? We're talking about some divine nature behind this man who is standing opposite him. So let's read a little bit further. And Joshua went to him, so he approached him and said to him, "Are you for us or our adversaries?" So he said, "No, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." All right, so it's interesting that he says here, he says, "I'm not for you or for them, I am for who? The Lord. I'm a commander of the Lord's army." And Joshua fell to his face and worshipped. And then we see here that every single other time we read of a case where a man has fallen down on his face and worshiped, if the being is not worthy of worship, what does that being always say? Rise up, do not worship me. But here we see where this commander of the Lord's army accepts worship from Joshua. Okay? So, and then he says, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" So Joshua acknowledges this man as, if nothing else, as a commander of the Lord's army, then he certainly has a stature above Joshua. Joshua is a commander of the Lord's army on earth. This is a commander of the Lord's army, a spiritual army. So he says, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so. Again, the idea that where you're standing is holy ground. Told Moses to take off his shoes as he was standing because it was holy ground. So we see where this person had divinity. There was a divine nature to him. All right. There's been some speculation as to whether this was Jesus Christ, God incarnate, whether it was a manifestation of the Holy Spirit. There are many different ideas in regards to this, but and once again, we got to be careful where we don't say something where the Scriptures does not say something. We do know, though, that we can read that this was a man who identified himself as a commander of the Lord's army. He accepted worship, and he told Joshua to take off his shoes because he was standing on holy ground. So, if nothing else, whether we read into this that this was Christ, God incarnate, whether it was the Holy Spirit incarnate, we know that this was a being that was accepting of worship. So we have to realize that this was someone he was who he says he was. He was not there to confuse Joshua. He was not there to mislead him in any way. All right. So that's where we got to as far as chapter 5 is concerned. Let's go to chapter 6. You know, a lot of times we look at this as this is just a chapter with a set of instructions, but it's really not. There's more to it than that, right? There's a lot more that we can read out of the chapter than simply, well, on this day do this, on this day do this, on this day do this. There's a little bit more to it than that, right? Okay, all right. A little bit about Joshua, or a little bit about Jericho. I think there's been a little bit of miscommunication over the years. As a matter of fact, I know there's been a little bit of miscommunication. I think because we read about the idea of the Joshua having this being this walled city, and that it was this ancient, it was the ancient world where you had these city-states, these kingdoms, and Jericho was really a kingdom in and of itself, although it wasn't, truthfully. I think there's a little bit of maybe a little bit of misinformation going on. Jericho, by all accounts, was not some 40, 60, 80 foot tall walled city with thousands and thousands and thousands of inhabitants. That's just not the case. Most archaeologists and most people who have done the study of Jericho estimate there were probably no more than about 2,000 to 3,000 people living in the city. Still a pretty good sized city. I mean, for the ancient world, 2,000 to 3,000 people in a walled city is a pretty good sized city. But the walls probably were no more than about 12 to 15 feet tall. All right. So when we see these pictures, you see the illustrations for the kids' books. They always show here's the army of the Lord down here, and here's this walled city, and you have people standing up on the top, and there's this big. They make it look appear a great more intimidating than it actually was. It doesn't change the fact that it was a walled citadel, and the majority of the people who were living in that citadel were trained soldiers. These were people, they built a walled city for a reason. They intended to keep that city intact, and they intended to repel anyone who might dare to invade it. So they built this walled city, even though it wasn't as big as we might think it was, and even if it didn't contain as many people as we might think it might contain, it was still a formidable opponent for the children of the Lord. As they walked up, they hadn't seen a walled city, and here it is. It's on the other side. They've just crossed over this Jordan River, and their first opponent on this side of the Jordan is the city of Jericho. And here it is. And it had been standing for many, many, many years. It had done its job. It had repelled its invaders. So here it is. They see it. And what had Joshua done before this? He sent out the spies, right? Sent out the spies to look and see what's going on, what's happening in the city. I dare say that it was as much to find out what they knew about the Israelites as it was anything else. It may not have even been a strategic type of reconnaissance. It may have been, hey, what do they know about us? What are they saying? Do they even know we exist? Have they heard about everything that's going on? But what does Rahab tell them? What does Rahab tell them? Yeah. What does she say about what they've heard? Okay, they're fearful. There's a specific set of, there's a phrase that I'm looking for. There's a phrase that I'm looking for. What is it? Our what? Yeah, okay. Our hearts melted because we heard what has happened. Okay, if you look and you see what they had heard, they had heard as far back as the river backing up. They had heard as far back as God taking them over, taking them through the sea. Okay, now I want you to think about that. How long ago was that? 40 years. For 40 years, these people have heard of the Israelites. They have heard about their God who delivered them out of Egypt. They had heard about the God who brought them through the sea. The word had spread. And there have been, for 40 years, it's almost been maybe even a myth. It's like, well, did you hear about these people? And their God brought them out, and maybe they're just kind of laying in wait and biding their time, and pretty soon they're going to come through. He says that their hearts have melted. Their hearts have fainted. They have no hope, so to speak. Those are the words that she used. So they have no hope. So immediately, the spies are excited about this. I mean, they've heard, Jericho, they're frightened of us. And the king hears that there are men that are in the city that are spying out the city, and he narrows it down to Rahab's house, and they actually go to Rahab's house. Where are these men? Bring them out. She lies. And I heard somebody say, we don't need to get hung up on the lie. We need to get hung up on the hope, the faith that she had. Her faith was in the God of the Israelites, not in anything that Jericho could do. She knew that if this was the God that was standing, that was going before Israel, there was nothing that Jericho could do to stand in their way. Jericho was going to be laid flat. So what does she do? Shrewd woman, right? Very shrewd. She strikes a bargain. I'm going to hide you. I'm going to make sure they don't find you. I'm going to misdirect them. When they come to find you, I'm going to mislead them. I'm going to give them misdirection. They're going to go somewhere else. All I ask is that you save me and my household. All right? You know, it's interesting. It's interesting that towards the end of Joshua's life, he says, "Choose you this day who you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." This is exactly what Rahab is doing now. She had to make a choice, right? She had to make a choice. She could either say, you know, here they are, here are the two spies, or she could do what she did, and that was exactly she chose the right path. The misdirection that she gives them notwithstanding, she chooses the right path. She realizes the God of Israel is the God. He is God. So she chooses to go with Israel. And to their credit, they follow through on the promise that they made to her. So anyway, look in chapter 6. All right. Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. Nobody went in. Nobody came out. It was truly a citadel. It was shut up tight. The Lord said to Joshua, now like this, before the battle even begins, before the first march around this city, before anything else happens, before they blow on the trumpets, before the ark sets out on its journey, before the people give a great shout, what does the Lord say to Joshua? Yeah, he says, see, I have given Jericho into your hand. Has he? Yeah, he absolutely has. Why is that? How is it that Joshua has already taken Jericho? Because he is obedient to God. He says, what do you want me to do? You tell me. You give me my marching orders, literally. You give me my marching orders. What are my instructions? All right, I want you to, and he gives them specific instructions. And because he said, I want whatever you tell me to do, that I will do, because he did that, the Lord has already given Jericho into his hand. Now, I want you to take that, I want you to relate that to us today. What has the Lord already said to us? He's already told us what? You have a home. You have a promise. You have a covenant with me. He's already given us all of these things. What does he require from us? What's the one thing that he requires from us? Obedience. Obedience to his word, whatever it might be, whatever those instructions are. You know, it's interesting that God could have done anything to Jericho. He could have finalized Jericho's fate in any way that he saw fit, right? I mean, he's done it. No matter what, it's interesting that when he took the children of Israel out of Egypt, they didn't have to do anything except just be prepared to go. In this case, he's saying, I want you to, and he gives them the orders to march around the city and to do all of the things that he tells them to do. God's plans, God's instructions have always been his to give, not for ours to take into shape to our will. It's, what do you want to do? I want you to march around the city. And then I want you to march around on the seventh day, and then I want you to march around that day 7 times, and I want you to give a great shout and blow the trumpets, and the city's going to come down. Could God have done anything else? Could God have destroyed it on the first day? Of course he could. Absolutely, he's God. If he destroyed it on the 7th day, he could destroy it on the first day or the 3rd day or whatever. And the idea of the Israelites in Egypt, you know, the Israelites actually, by all accounts, outnumbered the Egyptian men that had control. Could God have given them the power to rise up and take the land themselves? Of course he could. I mean, the point is that when God gives instructions, it's his instructions on his terms, not on ours. And we look at this and we see, well, what if Joshua had decided to do anything else other than what God told him? What would have happened? What would God have done? They likely would have failed. Now, could have God have allowed them to win anyway because he doesn't want his name to be profaned before the people of Jericho? Certainly so. Certainly so. He did that in the past. But that's not what he does. He says, I want you to do this. And Joshua, being the man of God that he was, said, whatever you tell me to do, that's what I'm going to do. Whatever you tell me to tell your children to do, the congregation to do, that's what we're going to do. So what does he do? because he knows Joshua's heart and because he knows Joshua is going to do as he is instructed to do, he says, you see, I've already given this city into your hand. I've given the city into your hand. I've given the king into your hand and all the mighty men of valor. Then he tells them what you have to do in order for it to be accomplished. It's already going to happen. So it tells us today, we already have a promise, right? We've already won. I've said this before. The war has been won. The war was won 2,000 years ago. All we're doing today is fighting the battles. We're fighting the everyday battles. And those are for us to win or lose as we engage in them. But the war, the true war, has already been won for us. We didn't have to do the heavy fighting. Isn't that good? Isn't that great? You know, we're engaging in minor skirmishes, but the war itself has already been fought and won for us. All right. So anyway, then he begins to give them instructions. He says, you shall march around the city. All of you men of war, you shall go around the city once. Make this circuit around the city. You're going to do this 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall come to pass, when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up every man straight before him. So he gives them their orders. This is what you're going to do. For 6 days, 6 days you're going to march around it once. On the 7th day, you're going to march around it 7 times. 7 priests with 7 ram's horns are going to blow. People are going to shout, and the city is going to fall. The walls of the city are going to fall flat. It's going to make it very easy to walk in and take the city, right, when the walls are down. I think that's the whole point behind it. What he was going to do is he's showing here that he's going to remove the barriers for them. Whatever the barriers are from them achieving their goals, that's what he's going to do. We can also look at that in regards to us today. What do we when we're in obedience to God? What does God do for our barriers? The barriers that we have to have removed. What does He do for them? He takes them away, right? All right. Whether or not He completely lays them flat like He does for the children of Israel in Jericho, whether He simply removes them where it's easier for us to get over them and for us to overcome them, whatever it is, when we're obedient, God removes the barriers for us. Whatever those barriers are, especially barriers from being obedient. That's what He wants more than anything else. He wants us to be obedient. When there's a barrier for us being obedient, God will remove that barrier. He's told us, because He wants us to be obedient. All right. Okay. Everybody got that? A little bit of background. The idea of the 7. Of course, we know that 7, especially for the Hebrews, was a number of completion. Right. It was a number. It meant that whatever it was complete. All right. So when you look at Him going around the city once 6 times, that 6 times was the machinations or the works of God were not yet complete. But on that 7th day, God was going to complete that which He set out to do, and that was to lay the walls of Jericho flat. All right. So this is what they do. So it was, verse 8. So it was when Joshua had spoken to the people that the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord advanced and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant followed them. The armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark, while the priests continued blowing the trumpets. Now Joshua had commanded the people, saying, you shall not shout, or make any noise, or with your voice, nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth, until the day I say to you, shout, then you shall shout. So he had the ark of the Lord circle the city, going around it once. Then they came to the camp and lodged in the camp. Now, we'll stop here for just a second. You can imagine what these people in Jericho were thinking. They're already scared. They're not up there mocking the Israelites. They're scared to death. They said their hearts had melted. There's no hope in them. So you can imagine what it was like to see this massive army. I mean, this is not a small contingency. The Lord's army was a huge army. It was a huge group of people. And they're all marching around the city. And those priests are blowing the horns, and they're walking around, nobody's saying anything. They walk around, and then they stop, and they go back to their camp. You can imagine what's going on. They're becoming more scared the entire time because they're thinking, at any moment, they're going to attack. But they don't. They go back to camp, and they're done for the day. You know, they're going back and relaxing with their families and eating their meal. And they're thinking to themselves, maybe we have a... Then the next day they get up and they do it again. And for 6 days, these people in Jericho watched this massive army. All of them, you have the 7 priests with the ram's horns, then you have the men of war, and then you've got these men carrying a box on their shoulder. They're going, what's in the box? I want to know what's in the box. Here's this golden, overlaid with gold, and they're wondering, what is this thing? What do they have inside that box? And there they go. They march around, and they go back, and they lodge in their camp. Okay. 6 days. Day 1, petrified. Day 2, now is it going to happen? Day 3, and they're just getting scareder and more scared and more scared and more scared. And then, of course, we know what happens in verse 12 and continuing on. I'll tell you what, verse 15. They do this for 6 days. But it came to pass on the 7th day, that day of completion, right? 7th day, that they rose early about the dawning of the day and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. Well, here's something a little bit different. Now the people of Jericho are watching them. They go around once. They go, maybe they're done. Nope, they're going around it again and again and again. Now you have to know at this point, they know this is the end, folks. This is it. They're getting ready to attack. All these men are these men of valor. They're in the city. They're waiting. They've armed themselves. They're going to do their very best against this foe that they really don't know that much about. That they've heard these awful stories and what their God has done for them. Here they are waiting, and they're waiting, and they're waiting, and they go around twice, 3 times, and 4, 5, and then 6, and then 7, and it finishes. But it came to pass on the 7th day that they rose early about the dawning of the day and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. On that day only they marched around the city 7 times. And the 7th time it happened when the priests blew the trumpets that Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who are in her house with her, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And you, by all means, abstain from the cursed things, lest you become cursed when you take of the accursed things, and make the camp of Israel a curse, and trouble it. But all of the silver and gold, and vessels of bronze and iron, are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord." And we talked about this last time, the idea that the accursed things, what are the accursed things? Thing that is in there that is not acceptable and pleasing to God. God told them, don't make for yourselves images out of what? Or, I'm sorry, images of what? Let me put it that way. Don't make for yourself images of anything, right? Anything that is under heaven or on earth or in the sea, you're not to make an image of any of those things. Well, what was the problem with the Canaanites anyway? They were idolatrous. So the problem is they were worshiping these idols, and every household had household idols. And they were images of some monstrosity. It could have been an animal. It could have been the image of some god that they had, some sun god or fire god or whatever it might be. And every household had these household idols. So when they go in and they start to take the city, what are they not to take? Any of those things, any of those accursed things, anything that they're not supposed to have, they're not supposed to own, they're not supposed to make for themselves. It's a curse. They're not supposed to take it. But what does God say I want you to do? I want you to take the what? I want you to take the silver and the gold and the vessels of bronze and iron, and they are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. So as God has taken them, what has He done for them? He's taken them out of Egypt. What did they do before they left Egypt? They plundered the Egyptians, right? You read the account, and as they're marching out of Egypt, the Egyptians are coming in, they're pressing precious jewels, they're pressing earrings and bracelets and necklaces and all of these things. They're giving them all of this treasure as they leave Egypt. God's making them wealthy at the expense of their enemies. And as He takes them out, here they go. They come out, they leave, having basically defeated the Egyptians already with almost all of their wealth. Then they march out, and they're marching to a homeland. They're marching to Canaan. Now, as God brings them into Canaan, He says, I'm going to destroy your enemy because they're my enemy. The reason that you're coming into this place is because I'm driving out the Canaanites because of their evil before me. I'm going to give it to a people that I made a covenant with. But what am I going to do for you as you come into this land of Canaan? You're going to be wealthy. This is all of these great things are going to go into the treasury of the Lord. They're going to melt down the gold and silver of their enemies, and they're going to make for God all of the things of the temple that is going to come eventually. All of these things are going to happen. Okay? So it's an incredible thing. God's mercy towards His people, God's kindness, and God's justice upon those who are in disobedience. Okay? We're going to see where the disobedience actually comes into the camp of the Israelites here in just a little bit. So in verse 20, so the people shouted when the priest blew the trumpets, and it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout. What happens? Exactly what he says is going to happen. What happens? The walls fall flat. The walls fall flat. You can imagine. Here are all these people. They've relied on these walls for generations. They're standing behind these walls. They're looking through the little holes in the wall, and they see what's going on. They see all these people march around, and all of a sudden, how many times is this? This is 7 times. And then they stop. They blow the trumpet. The people shout. And all of a sudden, these walls that they have relied upon for so many years simply fall to the ground. I don't know exactly the manner or method by which it happened. This says that the walls fell flat. All of their protection, everything that they built for themselves to protect themselves, is gone. Here are the people of Israel. Here are the children of Israel walking around with no protection whatsoever. And God says, nothing's going to happen to you because I've given the city to you. I mean, you look at the correlation between between Jericho and us today is incredible. When we make a protection for ourselves, when mankind makes for itself something that it feels it's going to protect itself, what happens? What's going to happen? Can it stand? Anything made of man cannot stand, can it? No. It's going to fall. It's going to fall, no matter what it is. If we make it for ourselves, it's going to fall. You look at all of these buildings that we've built over the years, all of these massive monuments to mankind, really, to our ingenuity and to our glory. What's going to happen to all of those things? They're done. I read that I'm trying to remember. It's the tower where Big Ben's the clock, but the tower is actually beginning to lean. In several hundred years, if it's around that long, it's going to be basically where the Leaning Tower of Pisa is. I mean, I didn't know that. I had no idea that was happening. But it just goes to show, here's the thing, people are looking at it saying, oh, this is here forever. This is a forever thing. But what's happened to it? It's started to move over a little bit. And if it's not taken care of, what's going to happen to it eventually? It's going to lean on over, and eventually it's going to be done away with. That's what happens to the things of this world. That's what happens to the things that we build for ourselves. They're done. God's power is, of course, greater than any of it. Okay. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey with the edge of the sword. Now here's where you get a lot of people criticizing, of course, the God of the Old Testament. And I've got a couple things I want to bring. One class we might have to just listen to it. One of the group of the people that were at PTP this year were Apologetics Press, and they did a fantastic study on the idea of does the God of the Old Testament, I'm trying to remember exactly how it was phrased, but how can God authorize genocide? Does that make God a sinful God, so to speak? How can we worship a God that would do something like this, and so forth and so on? We have to remember something about this. We have to look at this in the idea about when we try to bind on God the morals of mankind. That's a tricky subject, isn't it? When we try, God should abide by our morality and not His own. Well, what have we done in that case? Yeah, what we've done is we've lowered Him to our level rather than try to elevate ourselves to His level. What we've done is we've said, God, you're like us. How dare you do something that we disagree with? How dare you do something that our morality disagrees with? We can't do something like that. That would be unlawful. How can you expect us to not do something that you're going to do yourself? And what we have to do is we have to ascribe to God what God is. Is God love? Yes, He is love. All right. Does God lie? No, He cannot lie. All right. Does God sin? No, He cannot sin. It's not in His nature to sin. Not only does He not sin, He won't cause anyone else to sin. So we have to look at this. If God is not sinful, if God does not cause anyone to sin, then the acts that the Israelites engage in here, where they put to death the citizens of the city, are they sinful? No, they're in obedience with God. Okay, we have to look at why he's causing this judgment to fall upon them in the first place, and that is that the residents of Canaan, the people who were living in Canaan at the time, the Canaanites, were abominably idolatrous. It was an abomination before God. So what he was doing was he was purging the evil out of a land that needed the evil purged out of it. And we could go into another study, and as a matter of fact, I might address it from the pulpit, just kind of because I think it does need to be addressed, because this is something that happens on a fairly regular basis while the Israelites are taking the land of Canaan. We have to understand what's going on here, why God does what he does. But this is what he commanded them to do. I want you to destroy all the inhabitants. Don't spare anyone. Okay? So this had to have been a very evil city and region for God to cause these things to happen. All right. But Joshua had said to the two men who had spied out the country, "Go into the harlot's house. From there bring out the woman and all that she has, as you swore to her." And the young men who had been spies went in, and they brought out Rahab, her father and her mother and her brothers and all that she had. So you can imagine, they said, anyone who's living in the house is spared, right? So what do? What does Rahab do? What does Rahab do? Anyone that's in your house will be spared. So what does Rahab do? What would you do if you knew that everyone that was in your house was going to be spared from some great calamity? As long as they're in the confines of your home, that they will be spared some great calamity, what would you do? Everybody you possibly could, especially your family. You would do everything you could to bring your family and bring them in, just as long as they're in that place when those walls fell, that they're going to be spared. They're going to be not only spared, but they're actually going to be grafted into, and that's another lesson we're going to get into next week. They're going to be grafted into the nation of Israel. They're going to be accepted by, they're going to live with, they're going to abide by the laws of the nation of Israel. That goes to show, even back then, God was concerned about who? He was concerned about the Gentiles. He was concerned about them. And this. I mean, it's a picture of what He does for us, right? You know, here's the chosen, and what does He do with us? He grafts us in. All right. So He says, you know, whoever's living in your house, they're going to be spared. We're not going to kill them. But I promise you this: if they're not in your house, or if you don't do as you said you were going to do, then you will not be spared. So what does she do? She goes out and every single family member that she can find, please. You know, she probably lost a few that said, no, I don't believe you. No, there's nothing that can be done, whatever it might be. There are probably people who pushed back a little bit. No, I don't think I need to do that. I don't think I need to do that. So there were probably some family members that she did lose. There were probably some friends that she tried to please. Listen to the words that I'm saying to you. I have a promise. No, you're crazy. No. It's, you know, either we won't be taken, or if it's all done, we're all doomed. There's nothing that can be done about it. And so they didn't come into that house. Very much so. It's a lot like today, folks. I mean, think about that. If we know that there's a calamity coming, what do? We reach out to whoever we can find and say, listen, all you have to do is be in this place at this time, and none of this will befall you. Well, it's the same thing as when we talk to folks about the Lord's church, right? And salvation and coming to God through His Son Christ. It's the same thing. There's a calamity that's coming, folks, and there's nothing that can stand before it. It's going to happen whether we like it or not. And now our hearts can either be melted with fear, or we can stand firm and know that we have a promise that if we are in a particular place at a particular time, then this calamity will not befall us. We may lose our physical lives, but our souls are saved. But the question is this: while we're here, what are we doing about those who are not here and who need to be here? That's called evangelism, right? That's making sure people understand where you are right now when this calamity befalls. If you're not where you need to be, you're lost. There's nothing that can be done for you once that happens. But if you're here, if you're within these confines, in the figurative confines of the church, if you're here, if you're in Christ when this calamity befalls, then there's nothing. You're assured of salvation. That's exactly what Rahab does. She goes out and whoever she can grab. I imagine, it's like at the very end, you're just grabbing everybody, just pulling them into the house, grabbing people as they're running by, pull them in, whatever you need to do. That's the whole point, is to save as many as you possibly can save. There's a scene at the end of Schindler's List where Oskar Schindler is bemoaning the fact that he was not able to save more people. He said, he starts weeping. He says, I could have done more. I could have saved more people. I could have done this. They're saying, you couldn't have done any more than you did. He pulls his pen off, this little Nazi lapel pin. He says, this is worth so much. He said, I could have bought more people. I could have found more people. And sometimes I think that's the way we feel. It's like, I could have done more. I could have done more. There's more I could have done. You did all you can do. You've spoken to everybody that you could speak to. You've made everybody aware of what they need to be aware of. And when they choose not to listen, what do you do? What do you do? You move on. You go to someone else who wants to hear it. That's just the way evangelism works. You work on the folks that you're close to, that you always see. You're always working on those folks, but everyone else, you talk to them, you say, when they don't, what do? You shrug, you hang your head, you're sorrowful for it, but then you move on to someone who genuinely wants to hear what the Lord has to say. All right, we're done. We actually went a little bit over, apologize, but good study. Next week, we'll pick back up. We'll move on a little bit further.